Welcome to Sex Talks with Diana, a space where, from sex work to tantra, we tap into raw experiences to uncover how they intersect with sex and sexuality. Because knowledge not only lives in books, we listen to people and their stories. Let's dive in. So hello everybody, welcome to Sex Talks with Diana. In today's episode, we will be talking with Elle McPherson. She is a Certified Erotic Blueprint Coach, as well as a Certified Accelerated Evolution Coach, an International Federation Certified Life Coach, and RYT-200 Kripalu Yoga teacher. Through her coaching and teaching, Ellie's mission is to empower people to find freedom in owning their authentic erotic selves. So welcome, Ellie. It's a pleasure to have you here. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Great. So, the first question, because the word that we repeat a lot just a moment ago was coach, right? So what drove you to this job of coaching people?
That's a good question. I was in a previous life working for nonprofits. I had a background in international development, and I was living in Washington, D.C., and I was working as a finance and operations manager for a nonprofit. And I just kind of got burned out on doing that and decided at some point I realized, either I could keep going down this path and become really focused on my career and being in DC and working in the nonprofit sector, which didn't feel exactly accurate to me. Or the other path that I was seeing at that time in my life in my mid-30s was moving back home and getting married and having kids. And I saw a lot of my friends doing that. And neither one of those really felt like the right path for me, but I wasn't really seeing other options. So I've always loved to travel. So I decided that I would finally live my dreams of traveling, which I had been kind of too scared or hadn't given myself permission to do at earlier points in my life. So I sold all my stuff. I quit my job. I studied yoga, and then I started traveling. And during that time when I was traveling, I really thought a lot about, what do I want to be when I grow up? And I'd heard of coaching, but I didn't really know what it was. But it kind of kept coming back to me because when I thought about everything I had really loved about the jobs I'd had, it had always been the mentoring piece, the kind of HR piece of talking to my younger coworkers or talking to my boss about more of like the personal development side of work. So when I came back from that 6 months of traveling, I enrolled in a coaching program, and then just doors kept opening from there and wanting to pursue other things. So I did one coaching certification, and I learned about something else. I wanted to study that, and just this whole world opened up to me.
That's very great. Because in a way, it's like you found your life purpose after traveling. That's great. So one of the main things that you do is that you work with, this concept of the erotic blueprints. So maybe for our listeners and maybe for the people who might not know, what are the erotic blueprints?
Yeah, sure. So if people often have heard of the idea of the 5 love languages, which can be a good way to introduce like the similarity. It's not exactly the same thing, but this idea that of the erotic blueprints, it's a framework for understanding how we're each wired differently in terms of how our bodies respond to pleasure and touch. So we're not all the same when it comes to how we react to what turns us on in life, whether that's in the bedroom or in life. We're all walking around in a body, and we have different bodies that react differently. So it's a framework for understanding how we're each wired differently. And then you can also think of the erotic blueprints as different flavors of sexuality, right? So while we're all wired differently, there's also different options to how pleasure can be felt in our bodies. And it's really opening up to that idea that sex and pleasure can be a lot bigger than what we've been led to see on TV and mainstream media.
Okay. And maybe could you also, for the people that are listening, maybe not know about it, can you explain briefly what are the 5 love languages?
Exactly. So there's the 5 love languages, the concept by, I think his name is Gary Chapman. So it's the idea of, I think the 5 love languages are physical affection, words of appreciation, gifts,
quality time.
Quality time, yeah. So the idea being, right, if we are in a partnership, whether that's romantic or we're just friends, maybe I express my care for you by wanting to spend time with you. But your way of doing that is by giving me gifts. If gifts don't mean anything to me, I'm not reading that and seeing that that's what you're doing for me. And that could lead to miscommunication, thinking that this person doesn't care about me. So that's how that concept works in terms of love languages. And the erotic blueprints, there are 5 erotic blueprints. They are energetic, sensual, sexual, kinky, and shapeshifter. So you can think of those as 5 ways that people respond to affection, physical affection, or turn on. It doesn't always have to be physical. So similarly, if we were in a relationship, and the way that I get turned on is sensual, right? Through snuggles and kisses and physical proximity. But let's say I'm with somebody whose primary blueprint type is more energetic. They're more turned on by space and tease and anticipation. If we don't see that difference in each other, we might get resentful of each other. We might have miscommunications. We might think that we don't have a good sex life. And it may just be that we're speaking 2 different languages. Like you're speaking German, I'm speaking French. And when we can see what's going on, the reality of it, we can learn a little bit about each other's languages if we care about each other and meet each other in a place that satisfies both of us. So it's a lot about learning where your partner's coming from and how to speak their language.
Okay. And why did you decide to study the erotic blueprints? Why did you decide to study the erotic blueprints?
So it was kind of by chance, to be honest. It wasn't something that I was actively pursuing, but I had already become a life coach. And through that, I'd been introduced to the work of a woman named Mama Gina, who's a big teacher on feminism and pussy power and all this stuff. And so through her work, as I was saying, things open, so I got involved with her work. And then she had this woman, Jaya, as a guest speaker on one of her programs. And when I heard Jaya, who's the founder of the Erotic Blueprint, speak, I was just like, oh, this woman is so honest. She was so genuine. There's something about the way that she spoke that really called to me. And then she had an invitation to a conference that she was giving. So I was like, why not? I'll go see what happens. I went being like, I'm just going to sit in the back. I'm not going to, I'm just going to take this in for what it is. But after 3 days at that conference, this was October 2019, I was just so blown away because at that time I was already a coach. I had done a whole coaching certification program. It was all about, living your best life and being authentic and blah, blah. But I realized that not once in that entire training did we ever talk about sexuality. And then going to this conference about sexuality, it was just this like light bulb moment for me, because how can you be living your best life, most authentic, turned on, life, if your sexuality is something that you haven't even looked at? Or, if you're a CEO of a company and you and your wife are fighting, obviously that's going to affect how you show up at work. Or, if you're the first lady of the US, let's say, and again, like that's a piece of your life that you don't feel confident about the way you feel in your body, or you don't feel confident about your sexuality. That's going to show up in how you are as a leader, right? So you can't it's like this piece of ourselves that we don't talk about. And yet it's really fundamental to how we show up in the world. So when I had that kind of aha moment at that conference, and also just being in a room of people who were talking so openly about these concepts, it was just really liberating. And I wanted to be in it.
So you've also mentioned before, so we've covered what the 5 erotic blueprints are briefly, but you've also mentioned that you've said the journey of the erotic blueprints starts with determining your sexuality stage and blueprint. So what do you exactly mean by sexuality stage in this case?
Yeah. So what I'm referring to in that quote is that the idea of your core erotic blueprint, that there's three components to it. And this is not something that's set in time. It's sort of knowing where you are at any moment in time. So in anyone's core erotic blueprint, they have their stage, which I'll explain in a second, their type, which I briefly covered the 5 types. And then there's this third piece, which is around your shadows and obstacles, which for everybody is going to be different at some point in their lives. So kind of having that snapshot in time of where you are with regards to those 3 elements is a really great place to start. So the idea of your sexuality stage is to really give people permission to be okay with wherever they are in terms of their sexuality. So that's a bigger concept in the whole idea of the blueprints. It's about permission to be who you are, wherever you are in that moment, because so many of us have picked up messaging along the way regarding sexuality that something about us is wrong or broken or shameful. So it's really about just saying wherever you are, whoever you are, is perfectly normal and fine and good. So the idea of the stage, there are 5 stages of sexuality, and kind of knowing where you fall within that. And this is not a hierarchy. This could be, you could move along these stages at different points in your life. So one person might be really in a really resting phase. They might be choosing to be celibate for whatever reason. Someone could be in a healing phase. Maybe they've had a physical issue, like they've had a baby or they've had a surgery where being sexually active isn't on the table for them. Or maybe they're choosing to heal because they've had a broken heart or they've had some trauma. If that's where someone's at and that's the best place for them to be in this moment, that is wonderful. Maybe someone's curious. So a lot of people who join my sex bio classes are starting to get curious about their sexuality. They want to learn more. So they're going to classes, they're reading books. There's a lot of resources out there when people get curious to sort of go beyond what they might have been taught or not taught about sex growing up. And then there's the adventurous phase. This is someone who's maybe moved beyond curious into starting to experiment and explore and try different things. And then there's a transformational stage, which is where sex for a lot of people becomes more than just a physical act and more of a spiritual act in whatever way that means to the practitioner. So that could be like tantra or bringing in breath work, but it's more about the union of souls or union with the divine kind of thing. So any one person could move through those phases at any time in their lives. Like there are people who might have been super adventurous sexually and then been like, actually, I need a break. I'm going to choose to be celibate for a couple months, right? So wherever someone is along that spectrum, it's about accepting where they are in that moment.
That is very important because also once we start talking about sex, something that tends to happen also is that there are always like dominant narratives. And then it's like, if you're 30 and you're married, then your sex life should look one way. And if you're single and you're 20, then your sex life should look another way. So I think that's really, really important and interesting. We've been talking about the erotic blueprints, but I realized that you have never really defined them, each of them. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you could do that for listeners very briefly, just so that they have an idea of which.
Like a little more detail on each type.
Yeah.
Sure, I can do that. And I want to just piggyback one second on what you just said about the idea of shoulds, because the should thing is a lot of the source of the shame, and a lot of what the blueprints are about trying to pull away some of that shoulds, right? Because, like if I'm 30 and I'm this, I should this, right? Mm-hmm. There are people like who are in their 80s in nursing homes, like living it up, having the best sex of their lives. And we had this idea, you should this when you're old, right? So there is no should, right? It's about wherever you are when you're there and doing away with a lot of that should. So thank you for saying that. So I cover this a lot more in my 101 class I do around the blueprints for my sex bio. So I'll just briefly explain the 5 erotic blueprints. So these are kind of flavors, if you will, of sexuality. And also this idea that each of us have a primary blueprint type, which is our primary pathway to turn on. So you might resonate with what I'm saying. But it's also, while there's a primary, each of us is going to have, our own unique makeup of like a little bit of that. But I also relate to that. So it's not like you are just this one thing. So the sensual blueprint type, I'll start with the energetic. The energetic blueprint type is the type that's turned on by this idea of space and tease and anticipation. So if someone's energetic, if you come into their space too quickly, that is they're going to pull back, right? They need time. They get turned on by like the excitement of the waiting and the desire and the magnetic attraction to eventually become close with somebody. So for them, it's more the energetic quality of connection and less about the physical piece. So, and there's a superpower and kind of a shadow side to each of these that I'll cover in my class. The sensual blueprint type is turned on by the senses. So it's like texture, touch, taste, sound, music. It's that whole environmental piece of it. So they're going to be turned on by snuggles and closeness and music and the way the sheets feel and the lighting and the whole environment, right? It's really the sensory experience. Then the sexual blueprint type is kind of what we think of when we think of porn. The sexual blueprint type is turned on by nudity, genitalia, and they tend to be very climax oriented and goal oriented. The kinky blueprint type is turned on by taboo. And when I say taboo, that's whatever is taboo for you, which might be very different than what's taboo for me. Within that world of kink, there are sort of 2 main flavors. One is the psychological side of kink, which is generally about like power dynamics, playing and polarizing or increasing the magnitude between, like, let's say light and dark, giving and receiving, dominant, submissive, that whole very psychological piece. There's also the more physical piece in the kink world, which could be more around like physical restraint, let's say, like, being tied up or spanking or that kind of thing, or intense sensation like scratching or spanking. So within that world, there's a lot of possibility for fantasy and role playing. And then the shapeshifter is kind of all of the above. It's like the shapeshifter is a little bit of all of that turned on by everything, having a huge capacity for pleasure. There's that person who's always like, wait, was that it? I want more.
Okay. Thank you so much for telling us that briefly. That's very important. And I think talking about those shoots, continuing a little bit that conversation, I think you as a coach probably have faced more than just this type of problem. So what are the issues that you see most people facing when they come to you for coaching on the blueprints or on sexuality in general?
So I like to think of it less as like issues that people come with and more that people see possibility. So coming from it more of like a place of what's possible. So I think a lot of people might get to a place in their sexuality where they're like, really? Like, is this all there is, right? Maybe they've just been having pretty vanilla sex for most of their lives. And they hear about the blueprints and they're like, oh, it makes so much sense that this is who I am. And maybe this is why relationships or experiences I've had in the past haven't been as fulfilling as I have a sense that they could be. So I like to work with people who come from that place, more of like, I know there's more out there for me and I want to go explore it. So it's about then understanding, number one, like using the blueprints to understand more who I am as an erotic creature, what turns me on, what doesn't turn me on, how do I become more in tune with my body and what lights me up inside. And along with that, generally, there is some level of coming to terms with the things that might be holding us back in our sexuality, like shame around our body or shame around things that happened to us or emotional hurts, right? So sometimes you have to to move forward. Like there's this concept in sexuality around the brakes and the accelerators. So some people just want to go straight for the accelerator, right? I'm going to read a book. I'm going to watch this porn. I'm going to learn this new technique. You can throw a lot of fuel on a fire, but if the brakes are down, you're only going to go so fast. So part of this work too is then that idea of, okay, what are the brakes? What are the past hurts or things that I'm still holding on to or beliefs that I might have around my sexuality or around relationships? And it's a lot of the power comes in looking at those brakes, figuring out what's going on there and letting that stuff go. And then that's when the accelerator can really take off. So a lot of it is getting into that work with somebody to really then take them where they want to go in terms of their sexuality. So yes, I like to see it more as like, where could I go? With couples, usually it's more around this idea of incompatibility, right? Like two people who love each other, but maybe they feel like their desire is mismatched. Like one person has more desire than the other, or one person is wanting to, especially if people are in a monogamous relationship. So their ability to explore outside the relationship is limited. They might have been together for 10 years and one person feels like, I have this piece of me that I don't get to express because we've been together 10 years and our relationship has and our sex life has fell into a bit of a routine. And there's this piece of me that, wants to be more, explore different sides of me that I don't feel permission. So that's where the idea of the blueprints can come in and say, we all have these pieces of ourselves. They're all safe to explore. And teaching people what those different pieces of themselves are, how safe ways to explore them together, so that people can feel like all sides of themselves are being met and seen by their partner.
That's a very interesting way of thinking about it. I love the idea of the breaks because it's like, yeah, the whole concept of the erotic blueprints can be great, but if you don't look at the things that are holding you back from actually, exploring as much as you want to explore, then you might do half the job, but then you might not do you want to do it all. And I think I also find interesting how often it happens in long-term monogamous relationships, that there is this feeling of and this assumed necessity for this routine, because people sometimes are like, I would like to express this part of myself, but I feel like I can't. And maybe sometimes when you go and look at it in reality, that's not true. It's just that and this probably comes also from society, that we're just told that things work one way, that we just never even explore within our relationship with our partner the possibility of exploring or expressing those parts of ourselves. And I find that very, very, very interesting. And I think that's something that it's great that the blueprints are our path to actually, like changing that and be like, don't worry about that. Think about what you want.
Yeah, because it helps people see that this isn't just, okay, my partner is weird or different, or I'm broken, or it's like, oh, okay, there are other people like this, right? And this is just a piece of who I am. It's not something unique or flawed about myself. And when you have the archetypes to help explain that, it helps partners then see each other in a different way, and gives them a language and a toolkit to say, oh, okay, so you're really energetic. So it's not that you are sensitive or too needy or whatever that someone might, right? You're just energetic. That's how you are. Let's learn how to feed you in a way that's really going to make you open up to the full possibility of your sexuality.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think the work you're doing is very important for like literally the whole world. You're making a lot of people's lives better, and that is great. So thank you for that. So you've mentioned, and you've compared already the 5 blueprints to the love languages. And you've also mentioned the mismatched libidos. And then I'd like to ask you a question that can feel controversial, but I'd like to know from your experience as a coach, do you think that having a different type of blueprint than my partner can actually be a deal breaker?
That's kind of the whole premise of the blueprints, is that it's not a deal breaker. It's just that you have two people who haven't learned how to speak each other's language. So the idea of the blueprints is then to understand, okay, you're coming from here, I'm coming from there, have a lot more empathy, for ourselves and who we are, have more empathy for our partner, get a sense of like, okay, what are the things that would work for my partner or for me? And then open up the conversation to explore. So a lot of it is also about communication. It can be really, really hard to admit either to ourselves or to our partner what we really want. There's a lot of fear around sharing really intimate, vulnerable things. Even when you might have been married to someone for 10 years, but never really ever told them. Like this happens a lot, right? A couple were talking and it's like, oh, well, I kiss your neck because I think you like it. And they don't even like doing that. And the person's like, actually, I kind of hate it when you kiss my neck, but I just did it because I thought you liked it.
That happens. That's true.
This has been going on for like 10 years and they both thought the other one liked it, right? So part of this is just about opening up safe conversations so two people can have these conversations around what they like, what they don't like, what they want to try. And two people might be totally surprised to figure out that they both want something that they both were scared to ask for, right? So the idea of incompatible is often it's not being in each other's heads. So it's really about like just opening up the sense of possibility of what might be out there, getting people to talk to each other in a safe way without judging each other, and then just experimenting. It's like sex doesn't have to be this big, scary thing. It can be just like it's adult play. It's like, what would feel good? What would not? Okay, you didn't like that? Okay, let's not do that anymore. Let's try this. There's a huge world of play out there when you open yourself up to it.
I love that. I really love that. And I think one of the big things that actually stops people from having these conversations, and it's so funny because I feel like every time we talk about sex and sexuality, we keep going back to communication all the time. And it feels like maybe we're exaggerating, but it really is a core piece of it, because you just said it. If we just had this confidence, if we didn't feel scared of talking about these things, maybe even with friends, maybe it would be easier to talk about them with our partners if things were not built in such a way. So I think that shame is a big part of what stops people from having these conversations. And I think you've talked a little bit about shame already, and you've already mentioned that it comes from society, it comes from family, it comes from other places. I don't know if you want to expand a little bit more on that. And then on top of that, how do you think that we could do better as a society to actually move away from it? How can we change this whole thing that we've done?
So the shame piece, it comes from so many places. Like on the one hand, there's this, like in my house growing up, we just didn't talk about this stuff. So, as a kid, you pick up on that. This is not something that we talk about. So
Mhm.
even not having any sex education is the education, which is to say, this is not something we talk about. Um, so it can be kind of more like subtle in that way. Or even like the smallest things, right? If you're a little kid and you're watching TV and a sex scene comes on and you can see your parents get uncomfortable or they change the channel, as a kid, you're picking up that, okay, this isn't, something's off here. This isn't safe to talk about. There's little things you get picked up on by a kid. Um, and then some people are going to grow up in homes or in societies where it's far more overt, right? If your parents are saying to you, if you have sex before marriage, you're bad, or your religion is telling you that what you're saying, how you feel sexually is not okay, right? It can also be very overt. So either side, there's still a lot of messaging being picked up that this is not something that a good person wants to talk about. And then there's all the shame too around. Think about middle school, right? Like every little thing being picked apart. So many of us just pick up that stuff over time and build up this whole idea that somehow we're not, who we are is not okay. And then because no one talks about it, there's no way to be like, oh, you think that too? Oh, that's silly, right? So the more it stays quiet, the more it builds. So I think that's where a lot of it comes from. How we start to dismantle that, I think it's conversations like this. It's making it, seeing people that we respect, talking openly about sex and sexuality, unmasking a lot of these myths. I think a lot of it starts with early education, right? And
Mhm.
giving kids age appropriate ways to start being comfortable with their bodies, seeing like actual sex education that's not just saying abstinence or we don't talk about it or just some diagram of the genitalia, but actually talking about desire and your body and not, and like as puberty and as our bodies change, there can be a lot of shame around that and more about these are just natural bodily processes to be celebrated. So a lot of it starts because a lot of what we pick up, we've already learned this stuff by the time we're 12. So a lot of it
Yeah.
really starts really young. Or like teaching kids that to be comfortable with their bodies when they're little.
Yeah. And I think that's what we've done. With what you're saying is like we kind of have dehumanized that. It's like we don't take it as a, hey, this is part of the human experience and this is what is going to happen to me and this is what I'm going to experience. And I think it's so important, as you've mentioned, to teach kids to get to know their bodies, and so that when they grow up they can actually make decisions from what they actually really feel like they want. um because that's also a big part of what happens with sex and sexuality, that a lot of people are just following these narratives, these messages that have been picked up, but they struggle actually creating the narrative that will fulfill them specifically. And I find very important something that you just mentioned, which is how by not talking about it, we deprive ourselves from this possibility of having relatability with other people and being like, hey, oh yeah, you also like this, you also experience this, you also, because that is also it's part of everything we learn in life. Like every single thing we learn, we usually share it in one way or the other. Like if you're in college learning about physics, you're sharing this knowledge with your teacher, with your partners in the classroom. And it's like that for many things. How do you learn to have empathy and other skills with other people? You are with them and talk to them about it, and practice with them too. And then I think I actually hadn't probably thought about that way. I think it's very important that it, like the damage that actually does to just stay silent is big enough. And I think that this can take us to talking about enthusiastic consent.
Mm-hmm.
So first, what is it? If you could explain it very quickly, what is enthusiastic consent versus consent? And what is the relationship between enthusiastic consent and the erotic blueprints?
Sure. So the way I teach enthusiastic consent is about feeling the hell yes or the hell no in your body. And the way I would differentiate that from just consent, um, is that it's in your body. It's learning how to listen to your body. So consent might be like, oh, well, I don't really know, but they really want this. So like, okay, I guess I'm willing to. You just rationalized it. It's in the head, right? And sometimes that's not necessarily a bad thing, but being aware that that came from a rationalization place in my head. And I was probably overriding something that was happening in my body. So the idea of hell yes and hell no is to learn and be aware of what are your body signals, right? So hell yes, and it's gonna be like, oh I'm expanding, my chest opens up, my eye, and I start to smile. I'm thinking about something that I really want, and I can notice how my body reacts to that. Whereas a hell no might be learning how my body reacts to, and this is probably before my head even kicks in, right? Our bodies often notice what's going on before our mind gets to it. So maybe I contract, maybe my fists clench, I feel a coldness in my chest. That's a no. Like my body is saying, I do not want this thing. And listening to that before my head might come in and be like, well, I don't want to make them mad, so I guess it's okay. And overriding the signals that my body is telling me. So how that relates to the erotic blueprints is because the erotic blueprints at the end of the day are about your listening to what your body is telling you. So there's this idea, there's this erotic blueprint quiz you can take online, which is to give you an idea of what your primary blueprint type would be, which is a really great place to start. But again, when you're doing that quiz, you're doing it from your mind. And our minds are influenced by all these stories of like, oh, well, I kind of almost want to be, let's say, energetic because that's how I identify with myself, right? So you might be answering those questions from a mind place. But at the end of the day, the idea of the erotic blueprints, as you get into this work, is to not be in your mind as much, but just to notice how your body reacts to different kinds of touch. So, a common one would be someone's like, oh, I have an idea of myself as a certain kind of person, right? And then they're experiencing different kinds of touch in their body. And let's say turns out they really like being spanked. And that didn't really mesh with like their idea of who they think they are, right? But your body doesn't lie. So if you like being spanked, like, great, that's wonderful. It's something to learn about yourself. It's a new way of experiencing pleasure. There's no shame or judgment in that. But it's something that you kind of have to know through your body and less through your head.
That's very important. And I think for life in general, because that's part of knowing yourself in so many other aspects. I think sometimes in life, and I think you mentioned it when you talked about your life story. Sometimes you just do things because you rationalize they're the right thing to do or something like that. But then when you actually stop and listen to yourself, which might be a hard thing to do in itself, you notice that you're not really happy in that place, even though it makes sense to be in that place. So exactly. I love that.
Is this actually bringing me joy, or do I think this should bring me joy?
Exactly. And it's another shoot again. But in this time, it's under our heads and we created it and we're telling it to ourselves again. What we just talked about also brings me to asking you, because there in all the coaching titles you have, you're also a yoga teacher. So how do you use yoga in your coaching practice?
Honestly, I think it's more like my coaching and all this work has influenced my yoga practice more.
Okay.
Because I've done yoga now for 20 something years, and it used to be my stress relief, and it still is my stress relief, but it's changed because when I lived in DC and I was stressed about work and stuff, I would go for a run or I would do yoga trying to get out of my head, right, and into my body. But what ended up happening was I would be at yoga and I'd be, going through the motions, but I would be stuck in my head the whole time. So like my body was doing yoga, but really my mind was still ruminating about whatever was going on at work.
Okay.
And I really hadn't made that mind-body connection. So when I learned about the blueprints, and my primary type is sensual. So the sensual has the shadow of being stuck in their head a lot, but also the superpower of being able to be really in their body. So when I learned that there was that kind of like almost hypocrisy to it, it made so much sense for me. And so it's really changed the way I practice yoga now. I go way slower than I used to. So I've learned that for me to get out of my head into my body, I have to really slow down so I can feel things. Really slow down and feel things. And before I didn't know how to do that. So when I practice yoga now, I put on music. I like to have this like heat with the sun or a space heater or a fire. I have essential oils. Like I bring in all the elements. I go really slow. And I don't even know if I call it yoga anymore. It's kind of like yoga inspired movement. And it's just about learning how to feel, right? So sometimes I'll like dance if I feel like moving, or I'll move my body in whatever way that feels good. Or I'll think about how could I make this feel even better? I'll touch myself a lot. I'll do a lot of massage, right? So it's all about getting into my body where I have a lot of capacity for pleasure and to like let the emotions come out. Sometimes I'll just start crying. I don't know why, but something needed to come out. But before it was all stuck in my head. So it's in that way that learning about the blueprints has really helped me get into my body so that my yoga practice actually becomes what yoga is supposed to be about, which is about being in the present moment, about feeling what is real and present for me in that moment. And I would say that then in turn comes back to like my sexuality and just how I approach life, about being far more centered and calm, and my nervous system is more resilient, so that in terms of sex, right? I know what feels good in my body. I feel comfortable asking for it because I'm there and I know. And just in terms of life, I'm much more resourced. So when something happens where in the past maybe I would have like gotten triggered or angry or said something I didn't want to right away, I have that resourcedness in my body to pause for a moment and be like, okay, I'm noticing that I'm getting a little flustered. I noticed that I'm feeling hot in my chest. Like, what's going on here? Okay, I'm angry. Okay, how do I want to respond? And I have that time and space to show up the way I want to, as opposed to just getting mad and snapping.
So it sounds like working with the blueprints almost unavoidably takes you to some mindfulness practice.
Yes. I think inevitably, because oftentimes when I, do this work with people, the thing they'll say is like, oh, this work is about sex, but it's about so much more than sex. And yes, on the surface, we're talking about sex, but it's almost like a deep dive straight into where are the areas in my life where I'm not being who I want to be. Where am I disconnected from my body and what I really want? So yes, it's about sex, but it's really just like a deep dive into much bigger core parts of ourselves. And then when we look at those things, it affects everything else in our lives, which is really why I love this work, because it's kind of, you can go to a coach and talk about leadership and then, all those things, right? But it's kind of still at the surface. This is like, to me, like the most direct route to getting at the root of stuff, to really being the most embodied, authentic version of yourself.
And I think that proves how actually sexuality, because you were saying some people might think this is just about sex, but actually I think that's the whole point. That is just about sex, and then that sex actually is connected to so many parts of ourselves, and we don't tend to actually acknowledge that, in our everyday lives.
Because we're like, animals at the end of the day, in a body relating with other animals. And there's so much going on below the surface of our minds and how that all works.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. I love it. So right now, you actually have a couple of classes on our My Sex Bio studio. So let's talk about that.
Sure.
Right now, you have Unlocking Your Pleasure and Communicating Your Desires, which are both part of the series of the Erotic Blueprints. And you also have Releasing Shame. So maybe if you want to tell the listeners a little bit about what's going to happen in each class.
Sure. So that 101 class I do is basically an introduction to the blueprints. So we cover the idea of stage, which I mentioned on this call. And then I go into each of the 5 erotic blueprint types, going a little deeper into what are the superpowers and shadows of each, the turn-ons, some basic ways of feeding your blueprint type. So it's kind of an introduction to this idea of the blueprints. And then in the 201 class, I build upon that. We talk about the idea of enthusiastic consent, like we did here today, with a little exercise around that. We talk about each of the blueprint types, but more we go into the idea of communication, right? Because that's often the hard part. So using the framework of the blueprints, we talk about the auditory, the oral side of sexuality, right? So knowing the blueprint, you can use, so there's, the words we use, but there's also like the body language and the tone and the way we show up. And that can be, someone just can say, pass me the cheese, kind of boring. Or someone can say like, cheese. And there's a whole different energy to how someone's saying that, right? So using the knowledge of the blueprint types, you can match your tone, your language, and the way you're talking to somebody to their blueprint in a way that's going to take your sexual communication to another notch instead of just saying it, in this bland way. And we also talk about some communication tools in that workshop to make these what could be difficult conversations with your partner easier, to have these conversations around what are you willing to try? What do you like to try? And how would you want to be touched? That kind of thing.
And I think,
and then in the shame class,
sorry, before you go on, I think something important to mention. So the one-on-one class that Ellie has just mentioned is the one called Unlocking Your Pleasure, 201, Communicating Your Desires. And I think one important thing to mention about the 201 class, Communicating Your Desires, is the fact that you take time in this class to center people, to bring them into their bodies before they actually explore this whole communication around the blueprints. I think that is really important because it's really very, it's like that can really give you that aha moment of, okay, my body is actually feeling this by hearing you saying certain words. So it's a very, very nice experience. You can go on. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but to your point, right? So our heads might be like, oh, well, I don't like these certain words, or I would never want someone to say that to me. And your head is telling you a story based on the identity of who you think you are. And when we get grounded in our bodies and we just open ourselves up to, what might be true for us, we might be surprised. No judgment, just like, interesting data. It turns out I liked it when she said this thing. Awesome. You just learned something new about yourself. But it's being out of the mind and into the body. So that's a lot of what this work is about. And then the last class I do right now is around shame. So I mentioned that there's these 3 pieces to your blueprint: your stage, your type, and then these obstacles pathways. And that obstacle pathway piece is really a big part of kind of knowing where you are right now and what might be the obstacle or pathway to where you could go with your sexuality. And for a lot of people, shame is one of those big obstacles. And I say obstacles / pathways because sometimes it's in the healing of something that you open up towards the possibility. So they're kind of 2 sides of the same coin. So for a lot of people, it's shame. It could be body shame is a huge one for a lot of people that holds them back from being really comfortable with who they are and therefore being able to be fully expressed and fully open with their partner or with themselves when it comes to sexuality. Could be shame around their sexuality, feeling judgment towards themselves or from society around who they really are on an authentic level. There could be shame around shame. the levels of this
that's true.
On one hand, I'm an educated woman and therefore I know that I shouldn't feel ashamed that I make more money than my partner. And yet I feel shame for this, right? So I feel shame that I feel shame, right? All kinds of stuff, right? So in that class, we dive into kind of looking at what shame is, how shame shows up in our bodies, because it's not just in our brains. There's a physical sense that many of us have experienced of like, I want to run away. I want to hide. So learning what that feels like so we can recognize when we're feeling shame, where
so
shame might come from. So there's a lot of that. And then we go into some techniques for shame resilience. So how do we learn to recognize shame? How do we learn to overcome it? Some of those are mental, right? Like around learning around facts, around talking about it, around seeing what's happening. And some of them are happening more at a subconscious level, where it's recognizing how that shame shows up in our bodies and letting it go.
Okay. So everyone is invited to these classes that right now are going on our My Sexuality Studio, and you can register and find more information for them at mysexbio.org/studio. A quick reminder that these classes are by donation because we want to make ourselves accessible to all of you and give you this opportunity to actually explore your sexuality, because this is really needed in today's world. All right. And Ellie, thank you so much for taking all this time with us. Last question I have for you is, if anybody wishes to book a coaching session with you, where should they go? How do they find you?
They can find me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Beyond the Itinerary. And you go to my link tree or my link in bio on my Instagram bio, beyond the itinerary, go to my link in bio. I have links to these classes I teach for my sex value. You can book a discovery consultation with me, and we can hop on the phone or hop on Zoom and see where you're at and where you want to go and how I might help you get there.
Okay. So there you have it, Ellie, for all of you people. Thank you so much for being here with us. Yeah. I hope we'll see you in class, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Sex Talks with Diana is produced by MySexpire, an educational platform meant to empower people like you to take command of your sexual story. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, and Spotify at MySexpire. Visit our website and join our e-letter at mysexpire.org, and support our work by joining our Patreon. If you enjoyed this talk, please share it with a friend to continue the conversation. See you next time!